What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back with a special flashback review for Death Wish, starring the legendary Charles Bronson, which came out 50 years ago today, and I've been rewatching my Blu-ray over the last few days. And in spite of the fact that the case features some ridiculous box art where Charles Bronson's brandishing the wrong gun, and all credit goes to my friend David Lambert for pointing that out in the first place, nonetheless, I was blown away by this movie all over again. A movie that, in spite of its age, remains far more intense, far more stylish, and far more provocative than the great majority of movies released in 2024. And if we're being honest, it's far more entertaining than the great majority of contemporary movies as well.
This is Paul Kersey. This is the story of a man who decided to clean up the most violent town in the world.
But for anyone out there who's keeping score, in the first Death Wish, Bronson eventually wields a .32 caliber nickel Colt police positive revolver, but then he switches to a Beretta 84 Cheetah in the sequel, and then he goes balls deep in Death Wish 3 with the .475 Wildie Magnum. And fair warning, I don't know a goddamn thing about guns, apart from a little quail hunting I've done with shotguns with my family over the years. So if I've gotten any of those names wrong or the specifics on those guns wrong, blame Google. In any case, Death Wish is a part of a family tree of movies from the 1970s that some people call revenge movies, some people call vigilante movies, but throughout that entire decade, we saw a series of movies where someone in a hellish environment, usually an urban environment, would get pushed a little too far by young hoodlums and then go on the warpath.
He begins where all the super cops leave off.
And some of these cinematic relatives are closer to Death Wish than others, but among these cinematic classics in this category, I'd include Taxi Driver, Rolling Thunder, Coffee, Foxy Brown, Dirty Harry, Thriller, A Cruel Picture, I Spit on Your Grave, The Last House on the Left, and even though we're getting into sci-fi with this one, I'd also include the climax to the original Mad Max from 1979. But for some of the distant cousins of Death Wish, you could go with movies like Clockwork Orange, or Female Prisoner 701 Scorpion, Straw Dogs, Deliverance, and Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia. And I'm ashamed to admit it, but I've never seen Joe, which is often credited with getting this whole kind of movement going back in 1970s. But these are all absolutely ferocious movies. They're all well worth hunting down, and I can promise that whether you love them or hate them or find yourself morally ambivalent, you will certainly never forget them. And long story short, throughout the 1970s, some of the best directors in the world were attracted to these kinds of stories for whatever the reasons might have been, and in many cases, they delivered wildly popular movies with very long shelf lives. But no matter how you choose to define these kinds of movies, they all feature scenes where the protagonist of the movie is on one side or the other of some horrific brutality, prompting either one or more parties to embark on a quest for vengeance, basically naming themselves judge, jury, and executioner. And in the case of Death Wish, you have a character where he's a self-proclaimed conscientious objector from the Korean War who avoids gun, and he openly admits that his heart bleeds for the underprivileged.
Oh, Christ, you are such a bleeding heart liberal, Paul.
My heart bleeds a little for the underprivileged, yeah.
And quick side note, all my clips are coming from a copy of the movie that I ripped from the Internet Archive, but the image quality on the Blu-ray is definitely dramatically superior. But getting back to this story, Charles Bronson plays an architect named Paul Kersey, and after his wife is murdered and his daughter brutally raped by a gang led by Jeff Goldblum in this bone-chilling early role, let's just say that Paul Kersey's perspective on society and the city in which he lives starts to evolve. And for my money, the best of these movies are always the ones that drag the audience into unknown, murky terrain where they have to kind of ask themselves, where do they draw the line with their own scruples? And obviously that line's going to be a little different when you're rooting for Charles Bronson in one of his best movies, but that's what makes these kind of revenge movies and vigilante movies feel so dangerous and intoxicating, because whether you're thrilled or horrified or a bit of both by the violence, these revenge movies are much more personal than your typical action movie. And as I rewatched the movie and saw so many familiar landmarks around New York, where I've now lived for 16 years, the movie got even more interesting because I regularly take a bike ride along the Hudson right through the park where Paul Kersey makes his first kill. And from now on, it's going to be impossible to ride through that area without remembering this scene. Nor will I ever be able to eat a delicious steak dinner at Wolfgang's at 4 Park Avenue ever again without remembering Chuck Bronson sitting there watching the news about his exploits during the movie. And you can tell where they are from that iconic ceiling. And I first went there after my little brother and my sister-in-law had their first baby. But we went there to celebrate, but at that time, I wasn't watching Death Wish with, under a magnifying glass like I did over the last few days. But what is it about this flick that makes it worth seeing all these decades later? And let's just start with Charles Bronson. He's one of those great leathery old badasses like Lee Marvin, where they really don't exist in showbiz anymore, but he was raised in a coal mining town in Pennsylvania, where he worked before he enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces in 1943 to fight in World War II. So if he seems a little tougher and a little manlier and a little more masculine than your average, androgynous male actor in 2024, it's because he was. Like, he's a total fucking stud, and he remained physically intimidating for much of his life. He was about 52 or 53 when Death Wish finally came out, and he was still completely shredded. He had like veins on his forearm. It looked like he could bend an iron rod with his bare hands. But he got his first TV role back in 1949, and throughout the 1950s, he started appearing in some really cool flicks like Crime Wave in 1953 or Vera Cruz in 1954. But in 1960, he got to be one of the Magnificent Seven, directed by John Sturges, and that affiliation with John Sturges would lead to one of Bronson's best roles in John Sturges' film, The Great Escape. But in the decades to come, Charles Bronson would achieve legendary status in a variety of kick-ass genre films, many of which he would later make with Cannon Films, aka the Cannon Group, several of which I have right here, like Death Wish 2, 10 to Midnight, and Conjite Forbidden Subjects. But even though all the subsequent Death Wish movies would be made by Cannon, the first one was not. Golan and Globus bought Cannon back in 1979, and they gave a ton of work to the two Chucks, Chuck Norris and Chuck Bronson. And one of the more fun debates to be had amongst Charles Bronson's fans from this period is whether or not J. Lee Thompson or Michael Winner was the better director when it came to Charles Bronson vehicles. I would say that of the Cannon films, probably 10 to Midnight is the best, but I think Death Wish, which came before Cannon, is better than all of them. But one of the smartest moves that Cannon ever made was getting Michael Winner on the payroll, who had already made several movies with Charles Bronson, like The Mechanic, and Chado's Land, and of course, Death Wish. In any case, Death Wish is more than just a vehicle for Charles Bronson where he takes out the trash. The movie does two things you'd never see in a typical action movie. First of all, only 9 minutes into the movie, we're subjected to the most horrific home invasion scene imaginable. Paul Kersey's wife, Joanna, she gets murdered, and his daughter, Carol, is brutally raped, all while Jeff Goldblum turns in this terrifying but brilliant performance. But not to worry, I will not show that footage here. But the part that always gets me is this really eerie way that Carol kind of like rises up off the floor to call the cops once Jeff Goldblum and his gang have fled. I shouldn't say Jeff Goldblum. His character obviously has a name, but I'm just going to call him Jeff Goldblum. It was his first movie role. But unlike most action movies, we have to live with this horror for the rest of the movie as Carol descends deeper and deeper into basically a catatonic, like vegetable-like state, screaming in horror if her husband even comes near her. But I think another key part of the secret sauce to the first half of this movie is how much time the movie invests in Kersey's work as an architect. He's not some retired soldier of fortune, like living out in the woods, carrying logs around with like a giant gun collection. He's a middle-aged, civilized, like settled-down professional. And the film really explores his work with a ton of detail, in particular when he travels to Tucson for this project, where we get these really cool, lengthy montages of him working out in the desert as he's designing this new development alongside Ames, a character with whom he rapidly becomes best buds. And first, Ames, he takes him to a movie set where they shot Winchester 73 and Rio Bravo, and Ames probably would have had me under a spell then and there, but the real turning point is when he invites Kersey out to a gun range where they start talking politics, and Ames explains how, this is gun country.
You're probably one of them knee-jerk liberals thinks us gun boys will shoot our guns because it's an extension of our penises.
I never thought about it that way. It could be true.
But Bronson admits that he saw some action in the Korean War, but from within a medical unit due to being a conscientious objector. And while Ames might poke a little fun at Kersey initially, he shuts up really fucking quickly once Kersey hits his very first shot dead center, and he acknowledges, well, he grew up around guns. His father was a hunter. He was killed in a hunting accident, whereupon his mother demanded that he stay away from guns for the rest of his life.
God damn! Paul, you hit dead center!
And after this scene, Ames is basically obsessed with Kersey. He invites him to live in Tucson if he ever gets sick of the big city, and he even puts a little parting gift in Kersey's suitcase, the .32 that will be his weapon of choice for the rest of the movie. But Kersey's transformation, it doesn't happen overnight. It comes in these little, small, subtle stages. And what I love about all these transitions and these little quiet moments of reflection is how we're treated to this awe-inspiring score by Herbie Hancock. Now, as a little kid, I first got exposed to Herbie Hancock through his album Future Shock, and I was absolutely crushed to learn that we are not close relatives. However, I did get to see him play in college, which was fucking awesome. But at the time he recorded this score, Herbie Hancock was in his absolute prime. I mean, he'd been playing with Miles Davis for like a decade, but now he was on his own. And I'd argue the whole movie is worth watching just to hear Herbie Hancock's score. And the city just looks and feels so much more ominous and so much more dangerous when you've got Herbie Hancock's kind of gentle music pulsing throughout the movie. And I think his contributions to the film are just as important as any other ingredient in the movie, especially during the quiet scenes when we're all alone with Charles Bronson and we're just hearing some laid-back piano music in the background. It really is just like a marvel of film composition or film score composition. Definitely needs to be hunted down by any kind of jazz or fusion enthusiast. But in the end, what makes this movie so fucking addictive is seeing the slow, subtle metamorphosis of Kirsty from loving husband into angel of death, or judge, jury, and executioner. And it happens in such small stages that it's easy to go along for the ride before you realize you're in moral quicksand. But before his trip to Tucson, we see him prowling the street one night, and he basically just has $20 in quarters stuffed into like a sock or a stocking. He's looking for trouble. That's one of the big, I guess, like kind of dubious parts about this movie is that the crimes aren't necessarily happening by accident. He's putting himself out there as bait increasingly, and when people come looking for him, well, then he blows their goddamn head off. But early on, we get the sense that he's unsure of himself. He's not quite sure what he's going to do, but he's just looking for trouble. And then during his first hint of danger, we get this really eerie close-up where like the wind blows by. And it almost looks like he's afraid of what he's about to become. And this was the very first scene from the movie that I ever saw. I was watching Death Wish on cable, and I changed the channel once I realized I was watching a censored version of the movie. But anyway, I'd catch the movie later on. And in an interesting twist, while Kirsty's initially horrified by his acts of violence, like we see like his hands are shaking so badly, he's got to chug some hard liquor just to calm down. But he soon realizes he's feeling pretty good. Like people start commenting on it at work. And when his son-in-law comes over to visit, we see him just partying by himself. He's rocking out to music. He's having a cocktail. He's in this freshly painted kind of doo-doo brown, yellow, horrible room, the height of 70s fashion.
It's a little hard on the eyes, but on the eyes, it's cheerful.
Not only does he feel great, the city starts feeling great. Muggings are down 50%, not just out of fear for the vigilante, but other New Yorkers start getting in on the action, like little old ladies and construction workers.
And I ain't got no gun like this vigilante fella, but I went to my closet, and everybody better look out for me from now on.
It's like all of a sudden the whole city's inspired by him, where everybody just decides like they're going to become Batman and become vigilantes.
Well, the hospital report says the man had 2 broken arms, a broken jaw, and cracked ribs.
No kidding. Geez, a poor guy must have fell down.
But the movie's not all just bloodshed, murder, and mayhem. Like every once in a while, it'll kind of pause for self-reflection. And in perhaps the most telling moment of the movie, we see Kirsty and his son-in-law discussing like what are the options of what one is supposed to do if you live in the city and you're confronted on a daily basis with so much violence and danger. And basically, they're asking the question like, what is the point of being so civilized if you can't protect the ones that you love from unimaginable horrors?
What do you call people who, when they're faced with a condition of fear, do nothing about it? They just run and hide.
Civilized?
Now, I can't believe I've made it this far without mentioning the great Vincent Gardenia, who I first saw in The Little Shop of Horrors, but here he plays Frank, this inspector who's tracking down Bronson. And he has a level of sophistication and expertise worthy, basically, of Sherlock Holmes. And his performance is so good and his investigation is so eerily compelling that he almost takes over the movie entirely, letting the audience know that it's a matter of when, not if, Bronson's going to be caught, even if some of the cops on his payroll are a little bit weird.
Weird.
And sure enough, Kirsty's time as a gun-wielding vigilante eventually comes to an end. But in an effort to kind of keep the crime rates low in the city of New York, the powers that be, they decide that it's better for him just to go away if he just moves along and resumes his career in another city. So he picks Chicago, and then in this absolutely just bone-chilling but also hysterical final scene, we know that Bronson's time as a vigilante is just getting started. And for my money, it's a scene worthy of Kubrick, like at the end of Clockwork Orange when Alex tells us, I was cured all right. Like, oh my God, like we're going to get a sequel at some point. And sure enough, we did get Death Wish 2, Death Wish 3. I've never seen the Death Wish movies beyond that. I think they go up to 6, but there's like The Crackdown and what are some of the other ones? In any event, I've only seen 1, 2, and 3. I'll get to 2 and 3 in a sec at the end of the video. But I've been going quite a bit at this point without offering any criticisms of the movie or any objections to the philosophy or the politics at the core of it. But I thought rather than trying to pretend as if I'm like, outraged by the movie or aghast or horrified or whatever the case might be, I figured I would let some of the prominent critical voices of that era do that heavy lifting for me. So here's a buffet of criticisms that I found over on Wikipedia. Many critics were displeased with the film, considering it an immoral threat to society and an encouragement of antisocial behavior. Vincent Canby of the New York Times was one of the most outspoken writers, condemning Death Wish in 2 extensive articles. Roger Ebert awarded 3 stars out of 4 and praised the cool precision of Winter's direction, but did not agree with the film's philosophy. Gene Siskel gave the film 2 stars out of 4 and wrote that its setup makes no attempt at credibility. Its goal is to present a syllogism that argues for vengeance, and to present it so swiftly that one doesn't have time to consider its absurdity. Charles Champlin of the Los Angeles Times called it a despicable motion picture. It is nasty and demagogic stuff, an appeal to brute emotions and against reason. Gary Arnold of the Washington Post described the film as simplistic to the point of stasis. Scarcely a single sensible insight into urban violence occurs. The killings just plod along one after another as Bronson stalks New York's crime-ridden streets. Clyde Jeavons of the Monthly Film Bulletin wrote, superficially, it's not all that far removed from a Bud Bedecker revenge western. The difference, of course, is that Michael Winter has none of Bedecker's indigenous sense of allegory or his instinct for what constitutes a good folk mythology, let alone his relish for three-dimensional villains. And chief among the critics of the movie was the author of the book that the movie was based upon. He didn't really like what they did with his material, so he wrote a sequel to the original novel, which kind of took the story in a different direction. But I must confess, I've never read any of his books. But one of the more interesting commenters on this movie is Charles Bronson himself, who has said contradictory things about the movie. Let's start with his criticism, and then we'll start with his endorsement. But according to what I found over at IMDb, Charles Bronson once said of this movie, I certainly don't advocate anyone taking the law into their own hands. I don't think that the film advocates that either. If my films have a lesson, it's that violence doesn't pay. My opinion is that violence only breeds violence. Maybe you could say that about Death Wish, but I think if you watch some of the later canon films, perhaps that message is a little bit more unclear. But speaking of being a little unclear, Michael Winter was sharing a story about discussing this project with Charles Bronson. They just finished The Stone Killer in 1973. They were debating what their future projects might be. And according to the legend, Bronson asked him, what do we do next? Well, the best script I've got is Death Wish. It's about a man whose wife and daughter are mugged, and he goes out and shoots muggers, said Winter. I'd like to do that, Bronson said. The film, asked Winter? Bronson replied, no, shoot muggers. All right, that sounds like a story that Michael Winter probably cooked up to promote Death Wish 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, blah, blah, blah. And as I mentioned before, I've never seen any of the Death Wish movies past number 3. They go into the Crackdown, they have the Face of Death, and then there's that remake by Eli Roth, which I'd rather be on the receiving end of some of the violence in one of these movies than watch Eli Roth's remake. But I guess when it comes to Bronson having mixed feelings about this movie, I feel like everybody should have mixed feelings about this movie. Maybe if you don't have mixed feelings, like I'm not here to tell people if to agree or disagree or how to feel, but what's undeniable is that the movie's just intoxicating to watch. It's never boring. It's 90 minutes long. Same with Death Wish 2. Same with Death Wish 3. These movies don't overstay their welcome, and they're never boring. And so many contemporary movies are just awe-inspiringly boring. They're way too long. Nothing's happening. This movie gives you something to be excited about and to discuss and to debate. And you can really sink your teeth into it. And here we are 50 years later, and it's wildly more controversial, provocative, and just exciting than the great majority of any movies that you might see in the theater. Now, before I wrap up, I want to share a few quick words about the sequels, but Dino De Laurentiis, the legendary film producer who started making movies when he was 19 years old, I mean, he produced anything and everything for a 50, 60-year career. But he had the rights to Death Wish, which he sold to the Cannon Group for $200,000, and they proceeded to make a lot of Death Wish movies. None of them are the equal or as interesting or as complex as the original Death Wish, but they are worth seeing. You're just going to get a very different experience. Like with Death Wish 2, instead of Herbie Hancock, you've got Jimmy Page doing the score, but it's a little bit like the transition from First Blood to First Blood 2 Rambo, where kind of the message starts to shift. And in Death Wish 2, let's just say there's less moral reluctance on his part to just go on the absolute warpath.
You believe in Jesus? Yes, I do. Well, you're going to meet him.
And if anything, the rape scene in Death Wish 2 is even more disturbing than the first one, because it's it's committed against a woman who's like in a childlike state where you're not even aware like to what degree she even understands what's happening, and then it leads to her committing suicide. I mean, it is like truly morally repugnant stuff where you're watching, you're like, and also it's oftentimes censored in most versions. But if you're a sick puppy like me, you'll watch Death Wish 2 uncensored on Blu-ray. But Death Wish 3 is more or less just a canon action movie with like everybody in the set clearly is like, we're like, you know, like, what do you want to shoot today? I don't know. Like, let's do another line. We'll figure it out.
Bringing justice to the streets. Charles Bronson, Death Wish 3.
It has to be seen to be believed. But let's just say that if you're looking for any of the kind of the depth of the original Death Wish, by the time you get to part 3, it's gone. But it's still really fucking fun to watch. I think all of them are available on Max or Hulu. Anyway, there's one streaming platform that has all of them. But once again, it is the censored version of Death Wish 2, which is considered, you know, pretty controversial movie in its own right. But I think that might be all that I wish to say about this movie at this time. There are other movies with 50th anniversaries right around the corner, which I'm tempted to tackle. I'm thinking about doing California Split by Robert Altman. I'm definitely going to tackle Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia with David Lambert. We'll do another one of our big Peckinpah videos breaking that down. But that's coming on August 14th, right around the corner. I know later in the year we've got a Young Frankenstein, but anyway, I'll have a good long look at the rest of the release slate for 1974 and see if there are any other movies that deserve 50th anniversary reviews like this one. But I really enjoy talking about old movies. I never want this channel to be exclusively about old movies, but because I feel like you can kind of get lost in the past if you allow yourself to, and I'm always very tempted to get lost with, you know, only old books, only old movies, only old music, etc. I feel like you must live in which the time you must live in the time in which you find yourself, blah blah blah. But I'm not afraid to do the occasional 50th anniversary review, especially even though I've already missed on this channel a lot of the really cool kind of early 70s anniversaries. I could always start doing 75th anniversaries, which means if I'm still running this channel like 20, 24 years from now, I'll get a chance to do all the early 70s movies that I kind of overlooked when I had the appropriate time to do 50th anniversary reviews. And also, it's my own channel. I can do whatever the hell I want. I don't need to have a specific anniversary, but I just feel like having an anniversary gives me a little extra motivation. It gives me a sense of a deadline. Like a deadline gives you a wonderful sense of motivation, or as one of my old teachers from high school used to say, a hanging concentrates the mind wonderfully. And yeah, when I saw the 50th anniversary for Death Wish was right around the corner, the potential hanging concentrated my mind wonderfully. But I'm officially speaking nonsense and drivel at this point, even more so than I was earlier. So I'm going to wrap this sucker up. Please consider hitting the notification bell, subscribing to the channel, hitting like, all that wonderful, beautiful stuff, and let me know what you think about Death Wish down in the comments below. And if you have any other flashback 50th anniversary review requests, let me know. But thanks again for watching. I greatly appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.